Welcome, everyone, to the ICA. I'm Monica Garza. I'm the Charlotte Wagner Director of Education, and it gives me great pleasure to see all of you here for tonight's program. And I want to also be sure to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Teresita Fernández. Teresita is an artist who really needs absolutely no introduction, given her many achievements both inside and outside of the studio. But also, for that reason, I'm just going to share a few highlights from her career. Teresita is a MacArthur Foundation Fellow and the recipient of numerous awards, including a Creative Capital Award, Guggenheim Fellowship, American Academy of Rome Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts Individual Artist Grant in Visual Arts. In 2011, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. She is the first Latina to serve on the 100-year-old federal panel, which advises the President and Congress on national matters of design and aesthetics. In 2016, she directed the U.S. Latinx Arts Futures Symposium with the Ford Foundation, which brought together artists, curators, museum directors, and scholars from across the country to discuss modes of visibility with cultural institutions. Her work has been exhibited around the world in both solo and group presentations and included in public collections. The collections include the High Museum in Atlanta, the Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Harvard University, MoMA, Fort Worth, Stanford, Smithsonian Museum of American Art, among many, many others. Fernández has also created numerous large-scale public sculptures, including at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, New Orleans Museum of Art, and the Madison Square Park. I just want to thank Teresita for visiting us and revisiting her artwork currently on view at the ICA. I hope everyone has gotten a chance to see it already. But before I turn this over to Teresita and to Jeff, my colleague here at the ICA, I need to be sure to thank the Ronnie Casti Lecture Fund for their generous support for tonight's Artist Voice program. We're really grateful for their ongoing support of our educational programs. So without further ado, please help me welcome both Jeff and Teresita to the stage.
Thanks, Monica. Hi, everybody. Well, first, I would sort of be remiss if I didn't give some extended thank yous to, I think, so many of the people who have supported my work on the Exhibition Forecast Forum in particular. So it's a show that originated at the MCA Chicago and was organized by a colleague there, Carla Acevedo Yates. So I want to say thanks to Carla for being so genuinely supportive of me and allowing me to, I would say, translate the exhibition for the ICA's spaces and the ICA's visitors, and throughout being supportive of all of my ideas. It was a really beautiful experience to have worked on this exhibition, and it's one that I see as kind of paradigm shifting in many ways, and specifically as related to the geographical exhibition, or even in ways of thinking about the Caribbean and Caribbeanness. And so thanks to Carla and all of the team at the MCA Chicago. I want to also say thank you to so many of the people at the ICA who support all of the work that we do. You know, exhibitions are not made in a vacuum by any stretch of the imagination. So thanks to Jill Medvedow, our director, to Ruth Erickson, our chief curator, for all of their support, and really to our exhibitions team who makes it possible that our exhibitions look so beautiful every time you come to see them. That being said, my sincere thanks and my humble gratitude to Teresita for being here with us tonight and for sharing the stage with me. And it's really kind of the continuation of a conversation that we've been having through studio visits, through other conversations that we've had the chance to have. And it's really great to be in dialogue with you, and I'm excited to be doing this here together on stage. So to begin, I thought we would sort of reflect on some of the ideas of forecast form. And one of the things that Carla told me really early on when we were taking this exhibition was that there were kind of three artists in the show who were kind of principally informative for her way of thinking about the framing of the exhibition. And you were one of them, and Maria Magdalena Campos Pons was one of them, and Christopher Cozier was another of them. And so I can really see in concrete ways, after having lived with the exhibition and studied it and installed it, how this came to pass that the three of you were so impactful, and it's recorded in a really beautiful way in the Forecast Forum catalog in the form of conversation between the four of you. But first, I thought we could start off by talking about the frame of the exhibition, which kind of creatively decenters the Caribbean in a way by thinking about diaspora as a way for framing, thinking about the Caribbean even to begin with. And so how the movement of people, both forced and voluntary, is actually sort of speaks closer to the subject of Caribbeanness in some ways than thinking about it as a fixed geography that is related to different ethnicities or different sort of geographical locations that can be mapped. And there was something that was really beautiful that you said in that conversation in the catalog that really kind of stuck with me, where you described the Caribbean as a mode of imagining that topples so many hierarchies. So I was wondering if maybe through the lens of a couple of works that we have projected behind us, one of them being Caribbean Cosmos, and there's another work called Rising Lynched Land that was actually the work included at the MCA Chicago. If you could just sort of talk about your approach to thinking about Caribbeanness as this kind of like creative mode of imagining the world otherwise, not according to some fixed dichotomies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be here too, and we have had some really good conversations ongoing. And you know, Carla's show, this show, was actually a really radical premise because, for the most part, the Caribbean has always been thought of in terms of geography, and of course, geography in and of itself is a colonial practice, right? Our ideas of what's north and what's south and cardinal directions and maps are fictions. And the Caribbean also is a kind of fiction. It's a kind of invention in the way that we refer to it. And so the show was quite unique, I think, in the art world and in the sort of history of exhibition making, in that it wasn't so much looking at the region per se, and it was really embracing what I think is the thing that defines the Caribbean the most, which is that it's impossible to define, and that it's sort of everything and nothing all at the same time, and that it is constantly, as a concept, evading categorization. It's really interesting for me, like if you look at this particular piece, which is it's a very abstract piece made of glazed ceramic. And it sort of looks like an aerial view of the Caribbean region with weather patterns, but it's not. And if you get close, you can kind of see that each of the little, I wish we had a detail of it, but as you get closer to it, you'll see that it's made out of, you know, hundreds of thousands of tiny little tesserae. And if you get close, you'll see that each one almost functions as its own little abstract landscape. And sort of like that fractal quality is precisely what Caribbeanness is like, right? This thing that constantly breaks down into bigger and smaller parts simultaneously. And I think that the other thing that was really important about imagining the region differently is that it was a way of actually having like an expansive conversation about what we think of as global. So the Caribbean is, you know, the original point of colonization, and it is where our idea, our very premises of what is global get shaped. In the 1500s, the world was basically for the first time drawn up in completion, and everything was categorized. You know, some things became north, some things became south, with assignments as to a kind of hierarchy of what meant what. Our notions of modernity come out of that same gesture, which also means that the categorization of what then becomes primitive is also created alongside of it. And all of this is encompassed in this sort of place, which is even hard to define in terms of its physical edges, right? And so you have this archipelago of all these islands, over 700 islands, and you have all of these different languages that are spoken there, you know, English, Spanish, French, Dutch, several Creole indigenous languages. It's really hard to define sort of the borders, right? Because the Caribbean isn't just all these little islands, you know, and I say little sort of in quotes, right? It's also the space between them and the relationship between their size and their sort of perceived peripherality, right? Their peripheralness that we kind of imagine, in relation always to this kind of continental dominance, which has to do with the size of, the big continent in relation to the tiny little islands, which are thought of as small and on the outside. I also think of the Caribbean as being a very slippery kind of concept that is about a sort of coming and going, and what Glissant refers to as a kind of rhizomatic, dynamic and ever-changing pattern, right? That goes and returns and is constantly in this state of flux. In his iconic book, Poetics of Relation, Glissant actually refers to this idea of the Caribbean as most like the metaphor of the shoreline, as something that's always kind of moving. And he refers to this man walking on the beach along the shore, constantly having to recalibrate his own wayfinding in relation to all of these moving elements around him on the shoreline, as this kind of metaphor for what it means to go and to return constantly. And I think we'll talk about Ana Mendieta later, but it's especially important, I think, in this show that it includes the diaspora within Caribbeanness, because so often for artists like myself who have hyphenated identities, you're either or. And so in Cuba, I might be thought of as American, but in the United States, I'd be thought of as Cuban. And usually the way the stories of art making when attached to a region are told is that they're limited by one thing or the other, either by birth. So say somebody like Carmen Herrera, who was born in Cuba and is thought of as a Cuban artist, actually lived off of Union Square for the last 76 years of her life. She's not really thought of as an American artist, but an artist, say, like Rothko, who came to the United States at the same age as Ana Mendieta, would not be thought of as a Russian artist. He's thought of as an American artist. And so when forecasts form as a premise for the show, embraced the complexity with which the Caribbean demands to be seen, then it was able to sort of tease out the kinds of, the depth and the sort of overlapping of how the Caribbean is sort of everywhere, right? And that global invention means that it kind of is here, there, and everywhere simultaneously. And I think in a lot of my works, that simultaneity, that sort of rejection of a kind of binary either or is really crucial. And I really think that it is within those nuances that all of the important stuff lives. Yeah.
And so when you received the initial invitation to participate in the exhibition, how did you arrive at this work, Rising Lynched Land, which was a work you made in 2020? It's a really monumental work, 16 feet tall. And this is actually an image of it at the MCA in Chicago, where it was originally included. How did your conversations play out with Carla for you, where this was the work that kind of spoke directly to the way of thinking that you've just really beautifully described?
Mm-hmm. Well, Rising Lynched Land is a piece that I made before the MCA show, and it was actually shown during in 2020. So it didn't get seen that much, actually. And it's actually a very sad piece. It's a very somber piece, and it was a hard piece for me to make. The title is important, and what I was trying to do, well, I mean, first of all, the imagery. So, at the beginning, this was not the piece that was going to be in the forecast form original leg of the show, because it was a palm tree, and that just seems like such an obvious way to refer to the Caribbean, which is what the piece is about. So in the title, Rising Lynched Land, I'm kind of doing two things, which is that I'm making a reference to, I mean, it's a lynching, but it's a lynching of the landscape and this kind of displacement. The root ball is really important. The rope element is really important. It's made out of copper. There are all these kinds of material specificity in the choices of materials that are important. But it also has a kind of redemptive quality, so the rising in the first part of the title is also important, because I see it as sort of like this thing that's been uprooted, but it's also sort of ascending. And the reason why I say that it was a hard piece to make is because my work is normally much more abstract, and this particular show called Maelstrom that I did in New York at my gallery at Lehman Maupin in 2020 was this moment where I realized that it's sort of like the show that I had been avoiding making all my life. And I'll explain that because in the panel, Chris Crozier, who's from Trinidad, was talking about how much pressure Caribbean artists felt to be performative, right? So that if you're considered a Caribbean artist, your work should look Caribbean, AKA palm tree. And my response to him was that what I had experienced was the opposite, which is that for me to be taken seriously, or I would refer also to somebody like Felix Gonzalez Torres, which I know we were going to speak about too, there's a lot that was sort of nesting inside of the abstraction precisely because if you use that reference, it would be seen as a cliche, or it would be dismissed as a very narrow read. And so for me to choose this imagery of the palm tree was actually a way of, it was a way of reclaiming something that I was watching other artists even historically use, like Rauschenberg, who lived in Captiva Island for most of his adult career, and was making all kinds of palm trees, but you would never think of it as a cliche. Or Robert Smithson, who I'm actually doing a two-person show with Robert Smithson in July, who would make all of these conceptual pieces of upside-down palm trees, and it wasn't thought of as a cliche. And I kind of thought, so if I make a palm tree, because my name is Teresita Fernández and my family is from Cuba, it would all of a sudden be tied to this sort of biographical read on the very same image. And so by using the image and not making some abstracted, minimal version of something that quietly was referring to that thing, but hiding it, there was a kind of, it was very important to me actually to claim that in a very roundabout way that had, in fact, not that much to do with the palm tree itself. And it's interesting too, right? Because palm trees are not native to the Caribbean, which is so Caribbean, right? Because this is like the way that we imagine the Caribbean is collectively sort of like the cliches are always twofold. It's either sort of like island paradise or the poverty that stems from colonization. And these are the two polarities with which this region that's completely diverse, right? So like, to understand Haiti, you would have to learn about French history. To understand Cuba, you'd have to learn Spanish history, right? And these places sometimes that are 7 miles away from one another, like Venezuela and Trinidad, but you would never think of Venezuela as part of the Caribbean, even though it's 7 miles away from Trinidad. And New Orleans and the southern tip of Florida are technically really the Caribbean, right? If you look at the actual landmass and how it's broken up, it's literally the same piece of land, Islands are made in different ways. Some of them are made by basically volcanoes under the ocean that build up until they emerge and become an island. But others, like Cuba, for example, which is a very big island that's the size of about New York State, was actually a chunk of the mainland that sort of broke off. And so it's in however you try to actually define this as a region, it sort of falls apart. And there's something very beautiful in that. And there's something very beautiful too and very powerful about what exists in those places of possibilities that have not been scripted and that resist sort of one categorization.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just really quickly before we move on, we'll show a video that gives a kind of a better sense in some ways than the image does of the physical experience of seeing the work.
So this piece is very, very heavy. This is all made out of wood, and the top is very, very sharp. It's almost like a huge weapon. This is all made out of copper, and it's the diameter of that crown is big. So you really stand underneath it, and it very slowly sways because it has some weight to it, but it's suspended off the floor.
Next, I wanted to turn to hear a little bit from you about how you think about the landscape and how you think about this concept of wayfinding that you kind of introduced before, and thinking about that reference to Glissant's writing, and thinking about wayfinding as a really sort of critical aspect of your practice. And I'm wondering if we can think about it through your sort of like long-term engagement with this valley that people see here, the Vinales Valley, which is in Cuba, which is a place that you kind of return to several times in your work, and in sculptures, and now more recently in a film that you've, I think, just finished and will be showing at one of your next exhibitions. So could you use the Vinales Valley as a kind of lens through which to introduce us to your deeper thinking around how you engage with landscape in your work, the history of landscape, and also this idea of wayfinding?
Yes, sure. So this is the Vinales Valley in Cuba. It's just west of Havana and about an hour. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also sort of the oldest part of the island. It's the most sort of ancient part of the island because it's the part of the island that rises up from the ocean first. And it's a very sort of surreal looking place. The colors are very saturated. And it's a place that is super iconic in the Cuban imaginary. So it would be like, for Americans, like the Grand Canyon or something. So I have pictures of my mother and my grandmother with these mogote, these karst lands formations in the background. And I spent some time here. This is where I've been working on this film with Juan Carlos Salom, who co-directed it with me for the last, since 2016. And we're just finishing it now, and we'll show it in this coming year. And so what you see here is that the Vinales Valley is known for a few things. So there's an extensive cave system throughout these mogotes, these very strange kind of land formations that only occur there's a couple in the Philippines, and in parts of China, like if you ever land into Hong Kong for the fair, when they used to have the fair, there are these kinds of formations, but they're quite rare. And I think if we go into the next slide, maybe we can talk about Reclining Nude first. I think it'd be easier. Yeah, and so I was really interested in the Vinales Valley, and for a few different reasons. I did a whole body of work there. This is Vinales Reclining Nude, and it is made of these pieces of malachite. I think there's a detail that are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and when I found these malachite rocks, they reminded me so much of the actual valley. And so the piece is the way I think of landscape is that you're always in more than one place at once. And so my work for a long time has been about this idea of stacked landscapes, of how, and I do a lot of research when I sort of try to understand where I am. With this understanding that like the more you peel back, the more places you are, but also that there are sort of new places created. So the physical pieces of malachite are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They are depicting they're referring to the Vinales Valley in Cuba, and then they're making this whole new thing, which is the artwork itself, right? Which is neither of those things. So those same cave systems that I referred to are also the places where indigenous people, they're full of petroglyphs, and indigenous people lived there, Taino indigenous people before colonization in Cuba. And in the same part of the valley, in those caves where the caves were where enslaved Africans from surrounding plantations would hide, basically, when they would escape from from the plantations. And so by making this sculpture, I was kind of making a reference to all of these things at once, and therefore sort of drawing these lines between these places that are geographically sort of far away from one another, but that had all of these connections and also kinds of energetic connections. And like energy is a sort of funny word to use, right? It gets misused a lot. But I also really believe that the matter itself, the material itself, has a kind of intelligence to it. It isn't passive, and it brings this other element and this other kind of agency into the kind of constellation that's being made that requires that stands alone, that is not something that I have control over, right? It is still its own thing. And this idea that materials are, not neutral, they are parts of places, and that places retain the memory of the things that have happened there. And so by putting these things together, I sort of create something that's more than the sum of its parts, and that sort of creates this new landscape as well.
Yeah, and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit more later, but there's like in the sense of like the material intelligence and the energy that the materials that you use in your sculptures carry. There's also a way in which like you're constructing landscapes that are made from elements of the landscape themselves. And so they have this sort of like direct connection with the land or lands that is really sort of like particular to your practice and unique about it as well. And then maybe you could just really quickly introduce us to the film and like, how you approach working on this sort of document of the Viñales differently than when you're making a sculpture like Reclining Nude.
So the works all started to be made at the same time. It's just very hard to make a film in Cuba, so this took a long time. And this is the valley. And I didn't talk about this part. I think we sort of went back and forth. But the Viñales Reclining Nude, so there's always two parts to my title. And the Reclining Nude part was really important because I was really imagining the landscape as a body, and vice versa, like imagining our bodies as a landscape, right? And the way that we also carry landscapes within us in an almost psychic way, right? That we have, we are landscapes. We're made out of the same things, right? The piece in the show is literally the same carbon-based material that we are. And so, and I would say too that, that cosmology, which is quite universal in many cultures, ancient cultures all throughout the world, but it's a very particular kind of African cosmology that, you have the four cardinal directions, and you have this like horizontal plane and this vertical plane, but then there's this other dimension, which is the inward dimension, right? And it's like this kind of fifth dimension. My way of imagining the landscape is very much about that dimension as well, right? So it isn't just about the physical coordinates of something. It's about understanding the sort of quiet subtleties of how it is that something lives in our imagination and in our memory, but in our kind of construct of active construct of something, much which has been informed by false information, but a lot of which is retained as real information, and that the material itself still has in it, and that you recognize. So the film is basically a portrait of the landscape, and it's a portrait of the landscape looking at the people who live in the valley. In particular, one family that we worked very closely with, and they're lifelong friends of Juan Carlos. And it's a very intimate portrait of people living in this place. And it's a 16 millimeter black and white film that was shot completely there. It was developed in a basement there by hand. Very, very kind of like rudimentary. And it's, I think you have to see it. I don't want to say too much more, but it's very much like imagining that the landscape is this sort of breathing entity watching everything that's happening in it.
Yeah, and I mean, having seen it myself, I can say that there's like this really clear sense that like, yeah, that the landscape is alive and has like a certain sense of agency and is allowed to have a kind of agency in the scope of the film that's really beautiful, and there's this kind of interaction between the characters that also sort of like brings that to life.
Mm-hmm.
And next, I wanted to ask you about something that for me has been like one of the most, one of the best surprises, I think, about having worked on Forecast Form to install it and then living with it and talking to people about it all the time, that I didn't really get necessarily when I was in Chicago to see it there, is the way that there's so much artistic kinship throughout the exhibition. And there's a way in which, in the model of thinking about the diaspora as a lens for even considering the Caribbean to begin with, that exchange is really kind of one of the most important aspects of thinking through it in that way. And so there's a sense in which there's artistic exchange throughout the exhibition. There's the way in which Celia Sanchez was Alia Farid's teacher,
Mm-hmm.
The way that Chris Cozier was a mentor to several of the other artists, like Deborah Jack or Ebony Patterson. And then you've spoken really beautiful about two of the artists that are in the show as well. So I wanted to ask you how you think about artistic kinship, and specifically through Ana Mendieta and Felix Gonzalez Torres' work, who was a friend of yours as well. So how you think about it in your work, this relationship that you have to the artists that came before you.
I would say, and I would add Carmen to that too, right? So there is this sort of, Felix was a friend of mine. I never met Ana Mendieta. A lot of what we know and think and imagine about Ana Mendieta's work is constructed posthumously. Much of how we think of Felix too. I think that Felix's identity has been very much whitewashed, and posthumously he sort of has become sort of this like gay white artist, and it's like that's not what he was. That's not his experience. That's Felix was a brown man with a thick Spanish accent. He went to art school in Puerto Rico. He didn't come to the United States until he was like a very fully formed adult. His first home, and actually the city he died in, was Miami, not New York. And I think that with Ana too, I think there's a kind of intimacy that I feel with both Ana and Felix, and it is very hard to qualify, but I would like to say that it's a little bit the kind of opacity that Glissant refers to, which is there is something very particularly Cuban, and that's a very hard thing to describe or explain. But there's a connection to the land, right? And I feel it as well, which is why I did Viñales. Mm-hmm. And there's this kind of consistent, and Felix is harder to detect because it's so minimal and so abstract, but it's also there. It's just kind of, it's covered up. With Ana, it's a little bit more overt, but it isn't until she actually goes to Cuba and does the Rupestrian works in the countryside, which is actually not far from Viñales. We stopped there on the way to Viñales. There is a kind of closeness and intimacy and familiarity with a place that may not be where you have spent your actual life or the majority of your life. And there's something very indelible about how that factor repeats itself over and over again in very consistent ways with all of those artists. And I think that Ana's work, there's very little, the reason why I say that a lot of what we know of Ana, and to a certain extent Felix, is kind of constructed posthumously, is that we have very little footage of Ana Mendieta talking about her work, but there is one video that I love, and she's speaking in Spanish, and she says that she makes art about the landscape. And the way that Ana Mendieta's work is usually understood is that it's about the body, right? Because it's bodies, so depicts bodies, so it must be about the body. But in this one clip, which is the only video that we have of her, what she's saying is that it's about the land. And I think that that's actually very important, both because our bodies are like the land and the land is like our bodies, but because it is a sort of return to a landscape that lives inside of her, which in this case happens to be the Caribbean.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the work that's in the show is also, you know, there's an onomatopoeia to work in almost every room. It's sort of not explained why that's the case, and you're sort of left to think in your experience of the show as it unfolds for yourself what that means. And I personally don't even feel entirely resolved with how I feel and think about the function of that. It feels like almost like this kind of echo, these kinds of memory images, these kind of imprints of the body and the land. And I was one of the first tours that I gave of the show, and completely unexpectedly, and I hadn't even been planning this, but there is this book that I read called Dwelling several years ago that was written by a Native American writer named Linda Hogan, and she said, here's a lesson. What happens to the body and what happens to the land are one and the same thing. And I think that's something that plays out from one work to the next in really different and interesting ways, and sort of like lines up with what you've been talking about too, in this sort of like the sense of interiority and this sense in which inside of our body is a terrain as well that is also related, whether we are there or not, to these places that we have these deep connections to. And so that's something like and it was in front of Ana Mendieta's work that just kind of came to me. And I think that there's something really beautiful in that, and they're not necessarily related, but in this kind of like way of thinking about affinities of the relationship to the land and the people who live there, it just kind of struck me and was really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so consistent throughout much indigenous thinking. So like the Apache word for land is the same as mind. You know, it is also why we think of people without land as being without history as well, right? And so these topics of wayfinding and how we describe places and how we tell stories about places is deeply connected to our bodily connection to those places, and it is, you know, consistent through every culture and every part of the world as a common theme that's really important.
And maybe before we move on, if you could just say, you know, it seems like kind of radical to reinscribe Felix here, right? If we, you know, follow your thinking that so much of what we know about him has been constructed, you know, after he passed away, and that it has been whitewashed in a particular way to make us think about him in a certain, you know, subset of contexts, or let's say. What does it mean for his work in the way that you see it to sort of be reinscribed into thinking about him again as a Caribbean artist, and returning him to some of that more sort of like fullness, and that how accommodating diaspora is to him as an artistic subject?
I mean, I think it's really important. Not that long ago, all of his student films that he made in Puerto Rico were found. And, you know, they show a very different aspect of Felix's work. I think this too about somebody like Carmen, who I was close to as well, where there's a kind, this is why I made Rising Lynch Land, right, is because I could. But, you know, the understanding is that you could be excellent or you could be fill in the blank, Caribbean, Latinx, but you couldn't be both, right? And so there's a kind of, you know, and I'll give you an example. Like there was a big show that the Smithsonian did called Our America that Carmen Ramos curated, and it was Latinx art, Latino art, which the Smithsonian had never done. I think they did one maybe, I don't know, maybe 30 years or 40 years before, but they really didn't have a collection. So they mounted this show, and there was a review of the show that was, you know, very critical of how sort of folkloric it was. And there was a paragraph in it that said, except for the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres and Teresita Fernández, but their Latino credentials are questionable. And so the idea was that if you made work that was conceptual and that was minimal and that was intellectually rigorous, then you were thought of as more excellent, but you were also thought of as less fill in your biographical marker. And so I think that perhaps, and I don't know because I don't like to speak for people who are no longer here, but my guess is that, what I do know from Felix is that a lot of that had to remain abstracted, right? And there's a kind of progression, right, where you can reveal a certain amount. He had to hide a lot of those things, I think. And I wonder if he had not passed away, if there would have been some more overt references in his work, because there would have been a natural sort of progression. I think in my own work, it started to feel like I had outgrown the more minimal and abstract way of hiding things. And for me, it was a very particular moment. It was 2016, and it was right after Trump got elected. And so what was a natural progression for me, that's how I grew. I grew in a way that I no longer wanted to be neutral about things that were references that any artist who didn't have the same biography as I did could use very easily, right? And so it was a kind of not censoring myself. And so I can't speak for what other artists would have done. I would never want to do that. But I do suspect that an artist like Felix, who was such an amazing intellectual, would have, of course, changed and grown, and his work would not have stayed fixed in one way.
And his is like the least fixed work anyways.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
almost impossible to
Exactly.
have a fixed meaning for any of his works.
Exactly.
So I wanted to have a chance to also talk about this work that's in the exhibition forecast forum upstairs, and this is Manigua Mirror. And so I really sort of very early on in the planning stages realized that Rising Lynched Land was going to be too large for our galleries and we couldn't accommodate it. But I felt really steadfast that, because of everything that I knew about the show, that for sure that you had to still be in it. And so that really started our dialogue. And, I had the great pleasure to go to your studio and see this work in process. And it felt like being there in the room with you in front of it, like it was really obvious to me and to you, I think, that this was the work that was kind of doing some of the same things, but also doing different things than Rising Lynched Land, that I got really excited about. So this is Manigua Mirror, if you haven't seen it. And it was also, I should say, it was really clear to me right off the bat that this would be the last work that people see in the exhibition, and there was a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's on aluminum panel, so it has this reflective surface, and so I was really excited by the idea that people would go through this exhibition with so many ideas, with so many histories, with so many different narratives, and that in the end they would be confronted by this piece that you made, that is this monumental 5-panel piece, but they would see themselves in it, and that they would nevertheless, at its best, see themselves as somehow deeply intertwined with so many of these narratives and histories and stories, no matter who they are, no matter where they came from. So maybe just to get us started in thinking about it, you could introduce us to this work, Manigua Mirror, through just describing what a manigua is and some of what you were thinking about when you made this work.
Sure, and you also made me finish it faster. It was a very big piece. It had been in the studio for over years. It took forever. But manigua is a very particular word that's used in Cuban Spanish. It's not used in Puerto Rico, for example. Other people came to see this in the studio who were like Marcela, who's Puerto Rican, and she was like, nope, we don't use that word. So it's very interesting, like from one island to the next, even Spanish-speaking islands, like you have a very different history. But a manigua is a dense tropical forest in the way that we use it. Sometimes it can be a sort of swampy forest. And metaphorically, it can also mean an entanglement. So like a sort of intractable problem or something that's like a bind that you can't get out of. And the word is it's a Kikongo word that was used in lots of words in Cuban Spanish, mainstream, anybody in Cuba, come from the Bantu Congo languages of Central Africa because, of course, of enslaved people who were forced to work on plantations. The actual Kikongo word is, and I'm a student of Kikongo as well, but it's a beautiful, beautiful language, and there's so many words that I find all the time in just my everyday Cuban Spanish that I then realize are of Bantu origin. But the real word in Manigua, because of course it changes a little bit, in Kikongo it's actually Manigawa, and Manigawa it literally means the place where you cannot hear, which means the faraway place, basically, right? Like the forest that's far away. And the work is that scale for a reason. It's like you're meant to sort of be in front of it and sort of have it be bigger than you, right? You're projected onto it. And the idea is that you're sort of like both on the outside and the inside of it. There's this kind of flip-flopping perspective. If you go into the galleries and see the show, you'll see that there are what I refer to those rhizomatic lines that are a layer. There's lots of layers that are built up to make this imagery. And there's layers of density and reflection. So those rhizomatic lines are that entanglement. And binding is actually like a very important reference too, right? The way that things are tied together. The Manigua is also, the forest in general is really like a microcosm. So it's like a mini landscape that represents a universal cosmology. It's a small model of the universe. And in it, you can find everything that you need, especially all the ingredients that you would need to make magic, right? To make, if you've ever seen in the museum an Nkizi, a power figure, sometimes they have nails, sometimes they have binding and not nails. For the most part, they're highly misunderstood in the museum context. But what's inside, the medicine, the bilongo, is often made of many of the ingredients that you would find in the forest, right? And so the forest also represents all the parts that you need to construct something new and to manipulate those things. And of course, the Afro-syncretic religions that, of which there are many, right? And most people are more familiar with Santeria, like Genevieve Hyacinth's book, looking at Ana Mendieta's work. I'm much more interested in the Afro-Cuban religions that stem out of Central Africa, which are a little different and very much related to nature and to the materiality of the forest in particular.
And maybe here's a moment where you could talk about, another, artistic touchstone, for a lot of your work, for sure, but how you thought about Wilfredo Lam's The Jungle in the context of making Manigua as well.
Yeah, and I should say, to speak back to the material conceptual part, is that the Manigua is made out of charcoal. And it's charcoal that's been hand-shaped and polished. It's very tedious work. It takes a long time. It's built up. And it also has sand in it. And so the piece is much more a sculpture than a painting. And those references, so like the sand is from a particular place, and the charcoal is basically a burned tree. So I'm making an image of trees with burned trees. The image is actually the thing itself. It's not a symbol. And that's something that's really important for the materials that I use, is that I'm not making a picture of something. I'm actually using the thing itself, which means it's already that thing. I'm just sort of changing the shape of it. And I think you had Wilfredo Lam up. I was thinking about this. I knew you were going to ask me this. When I was making Manigua, I was very much thinking of this very important work by Wilfredo Lam, which is at MoMA, and which for a very, very long time, up until not that long ago, it hung in by the coat check room. It was never displayed in the gallery. And of course, there are no jungles in Cuba. So it's a reference to a plantation. And it struck me earlier, and I had never thought about this, but I did a piece in Madison Square Park called Fata Morgana, and it was also a reference to l'âme. Breton wrote a book called Fata Morgana, and l'âme did all of the illustrations for it, and they're all sort of like figures contorted into these like tree-like shapes. And when you walked under, it was like a canopy of reflective panels that looked like foliage-shaped panels. And so when you walked underneath the piece and you looked up, you saw your own your own reflection distorted into the shape of the cut foliage pattern, this canopy above you. And it's exactly what I'm doing in Manigua, right? Where your own reflection, in the case of Manigua, the figures and the figures between the trees and becoming trees and being distorted in the shape of the trees is, of course, the viewer rather than the depiction of a figure in the painting. And so it's also a dynamic. The reflective surface makes it dynamic. Mm-hmm. I often use reflective surfaces in my work, and to what you said before, Jeff, you know, the wayfinding part is also about finding yourself in the entanglement. And it's very subtle, but it's also very confrontational, and it's within this sort of like construct that tries to take apart the layers with which colonized versions of things distort other things. There's also a kind of, it's more than a prompt, really. It's a kind of demand in the work that also asks you to find yourself within that, you know, to locate yourself in the sort of entanglement that, you know, hundreds of years of layers of fictions that distort and continue to distort our ability to see where we are place you, mm-hmm. Right? And so it's a very sort of internal dialogue that in my work I'm very curious for the viewer to complete that circuit of meaning.
Mm-hmm. And for me, just like to say in closing, what has been most powerful in my experience of sharing the exhibition with so many people and always sort of ending with your work and talking about your work was also how you described to me how the entanglement is also a kind of place of refuge, a place where people can kind of gather and kind of like evade, be evasive in the same way that maybe we think of the Caribbean as being this place that sort of like is evasive in a particular way, but nevertheless, the people who find community there gather energy from the force of nature, and then when they do leave the entanglement, they're thusly transformed, right? And so like go back out into the world with that sort of energy that they've gathered together, which for me, in the scope of the exhibition and talking and thinking about it here, has been really beautiful and impactful way to sort of you know, have the narrative cycle of the exhibition end on your work in a really dynamic way.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking isn't passive, right? And so I say this about the landscape, that you look at the landscape looks back at you. And you look at an artwork, but the artwork also looks back at you. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, there is a kind of, I think the entanglement is multifaceted, right? It can be generous, certainly, if you're willing to look back, yeah. Right? And if not, then, you know, it's like it hangs in the air, right? It's like it becomes a kind of staring contest. But it's not passive, right? You carry within you what has also seen you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the strategy I think that I'm interested in, because I think it requires a kind of reciprocity and a kind of equity, right? This idea that like looking isn't passive, right? And we look in very aggressive ways, right? We cut things open, right? We chop them up, we measure them. And the things that we are looking at, the matter that we are looking at is made of the same stuff as us. It looks back at us, right? Yeah. And I think that especially of artworks too, right? When we sort of like consume, like visually consume lots of artworks, that they also like live inside of us, right? They haunt us, right? I mean, images haunt us. It's not for free. It is a relationship.
I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If folks have questions, there are people walking on both sides with microphones, so I just ask that you wait a second and raise your hand if you do have questions, and we'll get you a mic. Yeah, sure, just right here.
Thank you very much. I was wondering about the choice of the materials, and in particular about copper, because I was noticing, I think in Rising Lynching Land, the copper, the upper part is made of copper. Malachite is actually a copper-based mineral. And also, if I remember from history, like copper was one of the minerals that was mostly extracted from Cuba. And also copper is very fundamental for fighting climate change. It is fundamental for fighting climate change, which is, Caribbeans are the most vulnerable area of the world about climate change. So I was just curious about the choice of the materials, in particular copper.
Yes, to all of it. Copper and azurite are both copper-based, and they're actually the same exact mineral that just changes as it's exposed to the air. And so this is one of the things I really love about copper, is that it's historically been actually connected to the sea, because it's the colors of the sea, and it also is very much connected to references to the feminine. And some of the things that we know about mythologically, right? Like for example, in ancient cultures, there was no difference between silver and the moon or gold and the sun, and Venus was connected with copper, right? This understanding of like subterranean minerals having connections with their sort of cosmic and planetary counterparts. But there's also truth to it, right? So like women actually have more copper in their bodies, and copper is a really important material for me. I did a lot of work on the Caribbean that had a lot to do with Caribbean women, and how, for example, the birth control pill, which helped so many American women join the workforce and have reproductive freedom, was actually tested on unknowing, impoverished Puerto Rican women who were basically used as guinea pigs by Margaret Sanger in the 50s, as part of like also the eugenics movement that sterilized, a third through the United States, a third of Puerto Rican women. And so the copper is really important to me, and I've made several other works that are direct references to that, and to, for example, IUDs, which were also tested. Most contraceptives, the history of contraceptives, most of them were tested in Puerto Rico, as well as lots of things that continue to be tested. I will mention also that Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world and continues to be. And it's really important because sometimes we make these references to colonization as historically and abstractly, but Puerto Rico continues to be the oldest colony in the world. The island of Vieques, just off of the main island of Puerto Rico, was used by the US military for over 60 years as a bombing range. They dropped 5 million pounds of heavy metals, uranium, arsenic, cadmium, that still continue to contaminate the land. In 1998 alone, they dropped 23,000 bombs, and they're still cleaning it up, right? It'll take them decades to clean it up because they were bombing there until 2001. So yeah, the references to metal are really specific, and in some other works, they get even more specific. I think here you're seeing just the charcoal and just the malachite, which I've used a lot of also. But that specificity happens in almost all my work, right, where the material is very, very specific.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we just have time for one more question, and I think there was someone here in the front.
You mentioned the power objects or the power figures in Kisin Kondi, and I know that they have mirrored surfaces or little mirrors on their bellies, which are meant to like conceal the power packs or the medicinal packs. And I'm wondering how those mirrored surfaces on those power figures informed your use of the aluminum or the mirrored surface in Manigua.
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a question from somebody who looks at things. I like that. I would say that the reference isn't that like literal, but I've always had the same thought as your observation, which is that the small mirrors reflect back, right? You can't look inside of it. You're not supposed to look inside of it, right? It's secret. And if you're interested in that, I would recommend for you to read the work of Bárbaro Martínez Ruiz, who is a really incredible scholar and colleague that I've been working with, and he writes a lot about those details.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, Teresita, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
you.
Thank you so much for your generosity, and it's so amazing how much you let us into about your process, about this work, about your relationships with other artists, and how you think about the region as a whole, you know, in the conception of, you know, thinking about it otherwise, maybe. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for everyone for being here. If you haven't seen the show, the galleries are open till 9, so I invite you to go see the work for yourself. Thank you.